When a quiet boy at school reveals he doesn't actually have a birthday, or so he's been told, what seems at first to be a simple misunderstanding soon takes a deeply unsettling turn. The more the teacher learns, the more she realizes this is not just about a missing date on a calendar. It's about a broken system, a manipulative foster home, and a child who has been made to believe that celebration, and even love itself, must be earned. This is a story of betrayal, resilience, and the relentless fight for a child's right to be seen and cherished. Before we dive in, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you believe that every hidden truth deserves to be brought to light, remember to like and subscribe for more. Mrs. Gallagher could not forget the look on Jaden's face as he held that crayon, uncertain of which words to write on his All About Me poster. She had been teaching third grade for nearly 20 years. In that time, she had watched the entire emotional spectrum unfold before her: shy smiles, silly giggles, the heartbreak of playground quarrels, and the uncontainable glee of 8-year-olds who discovered new games. Yet, there was something about Jaden that tugged at her heart more powerfully than anything she had encountered before. She remembered the precise moment she saw his poster, that huge sheet of paper plastered at every student's desk, waiting to be filled with bright drawings and colorful facts about favorite foods and best friends. Most children were eager to scribble down the details of their lives. Dogs and cats had been doodled in the corners, sports or video games had claimed entire sections. Cupcake stickers or pictures of a brand new puppy often dominated the center. But when she walked over to Jaden's desk, she found nothing. The paper was entirely bare. She had crouched by his chair, her worn knees creaking. "Need help?" she had asked, her voice gentle. She remembered how Jaden looked at her with eyes that seemed far older than his 8 years, eyes that suggested a timid acceptance of something that should never have been accepted. He shook his head, barely meeting her gaze. His voice was so soft she had to lean in to catch it. "I don't know what to write." "There's no right or wrong way to do this," Mrs. Gallagher had said, her heart instantly going out to him. "We just want to know about you. Any favorite color, a food you really love, or your hobbies. Maybe we can start with your birthday?" She recalled noticing the way his small shoulders grew tense at the mere mention of the word. He glanced quickly around the room, as though to be sure no one else could hear him. When he spoke again, every syllable dripped with the same quiet tone of acceptance. "She says I don't have one." He paused, stared at the crayon in his hand. "I haven't earned it yet." Mrs. Gallagher felt her breath catch. She remembered blinking, trying to process his words. "Your foster mom?" she had asked, her tone hushed. He nodded, not elaborating. Fear flickered across his expression, as though even uttering these words might bring consequences. Mrs. Gallagher had tried to smile encouragingly, but her mind was already racing. She had encountered 1,000 parental quirks during her years as a teacher, but never had she heard of a child's birthday being withheld. It was so bizarre, so fundamentally heartbreaking. For the rest of that day, she could barely focus on her usual tasks. Her attempts to brighten the classroom with jokes or to settle small disagreements on the playground felt mechanical. She was too consumed by Jaden's expression, too caught in the swirl of questions that refused to leave her mind. After school, once the children had filtered out and their echoes of laughter had faded in the hallway, she reviewed Jaden's file, rummaging through forms that might help her understand who he was. It was all standard paperwork: name, age, academic history, vaccination records, an attached case file that explained he'd been placed into foster care a year earlier under suspicious circumstances that had never been fully detailed. Yet, there it was, his date of birth, clearly written as October 14th. She noted that it was only about 2 weeks away. Confused, she rose from her desk and sought out Ms. Alvarez, the school counselor. Ms. Alvarez was an empathetic woman in her early 40s who carried the unspoken weariness of witnessing one too many heartbreaking stories. Mrs. Gallagher described her brief conversation with Jaden, the boy's quiet admission that he didn't have a birthday because he hadn't earned one. She watched Ms. Alvarez's eyebrows draw together, forming a deep line in the middle of her forehead. "This feels off," Ms. Alvarez said, pressing a pen thoughtfully to her lips. "It could be a misunderstanding, but that's not typical. And from what I've seen, Jaden's a good kid. There's definitely something more going on." They decided then to do some more digging. Ms. Alvarez would schedule a check-in with Jayden, just a casual conversation, to gently unravel the mystery. If anything else suspicious came up, they would approach Child Protective Services. Emotional abuse was notoriously hard to detect, but sometimes, telling details leaked through a child's words, small clues that indicated a bigger problem at home. The next day, Ms. Alvarez pulled Jayden aside under the pretense of finishing a small, getting-to-know-you survey. She gently asked him about his favorite movies, favorite subjects in school, and whether he enjoyed the lunch that day. Gradually, she slipped in a question about birthdays and celebrations. At first, Jayden refused to speak, biting his lips so firmly she feared he might draw blood. But her gentle persistence, combined with a warmth that invited trust, eventually coaxed him to answer. Bit by bit, Jayden described a household so devoid of normal affection that Ms. Alvarez found herself stunned. He spoke of Ms. Regina Cobb, his current foster mother. She kept what she called development compliance logs, thick notebooks in which she tracked each child's chores, homework, and behavior. Jayden explained that in this house, nothing, not even a hug, was truly free. Kind words, small gifts, moments of warmth, these were all earned by performance. "I have to get A's," he whispered. "I have to do all my chores right away. If I don't, she writes it down, and I lose points. I had some points for a birthday this year, but then I lost them when I lied about finishing my reading homework." Ms. Alvarez remembered the chill that swept through her at those words, the realization that a child so young was being systematically deprived of normal affection, locked into a structure that turned love into currency. Jayden admitted birthdays were the highest privilege, something only bestowed upon a child who had perfect marks for weeks on end. The counselor's next step was immediate. She and Mrs. Gallagher filed a report with Child Protective Services, describing emotional manipulation and a possible environment of psychological abuse. The question was whether their case would be considered urgent. Ms. Alvarez was prepared to push if it wasn't. She had been around long enough to know that some children fell through the cracks. Within the week, a CPS worker visited Jayden's foster home unannounced. Mrs. Gallagher, who had been waiting on pins and needles for any word, received a message from the agency's liaison the next day. The visit had raised concerns. Further investigation would follow. The voice on the other end of the phone line told her, "Thank you for reporting. This is serious." Serious. The word was a relief, but also ominous. Even with that label, the process would not be quick. Investigations involving foster care, especially emotional abuse, required thorough documentation, multiple interviews, and evidence that wasn't simply based on hearsay. And so, for days that felt endless, Mrs. Gallagher and Ms. Alvarez waited in limbo. Meanwhile, Jayden arrived at class each morning with his shoulders drawn, often sporting a vacant look that suggested he'd had another night of withheld affection, perhaps something more. During that waiting period, Mrs. Gallagher found ways to engage with Jayden gently. She tried to create small moments of celebration. Nothing extraordinary, just the kind of recognition that typical kids took for granted. She placed a sticker on his math homework with an encouraging note. "Excellent progress, Jayden. You did it." She caught him reading quietly and praised him in front of the class, a small gesture that elicited a shy smile from him. In art, she singled out the detail he put into a drawing of a dinosaur. These were small steps, but she sensed they mattered. The way Jayden seemed torn between bashfulness and something akin to wonder was telling. It was as if he'd never truly believed he deserved praise before. About a week later, Ms. Alvarez pulled Mrs. Gallagher aside in the hallway, her expression grim. She had heard from the CPS worker. They'd found Regina's development compliance logs, and indeed, they detailed meticulously how the children in her home had to behave in an almost militaristic fashion to earn privileges. These privileges ranged from having dessert to being allowed phone calls with friends, even to receiving so much as a gentle pat on the back. Birthdays, the logs noted, were reserved for children who achieved near-flawless compliance for at least 6 months. If a child slipped at any point during that time, the clock would reset, and the child would lose the privilege to celebrate. The case was complicated by the fact that Regina's methods, while obviously harmful, didn't leave physical bruises. She could argue that she was disciplining children or providing structure. CPS had no illusions about the emotional damage, but it would require a formal hearing to remove Jayden or any other children from the home. In the meantime, they were placed under a protective watch, with social workers dropping in more frequently. Mrs. Gallagher felt a swell of anger rise in her throat. She'd always believed fostering was about giving children a second chance at a loving environment. To see it twisted into a means of controlling children so thoroughly made her seethe with quiet rage. How many birthdays had Jayden missed, simply because he wasn't good enough in Regina's eyes? She resolved that Jayden would have a birthday that year. October 14th was fast approaching, and though her resources were limited, she was determined that if no one else would celebrate it, she would. Even if it was just a single cupcake and a small candle. That simple act of letting him blow out a candle with his name on it felt like the bare minimum for any 8-year-old. But she had to tread carefully. She didn't want to make things worse for Jayden at home. Regina might see an outside party rewarding him as undercutting her authority. Still, she pressed forward in her own gentle way, hoping that the situation would be resolved before the date arrived. She spent her nights lying awake, her mind drifting to images of Jayden's timid smile, that flicker of hope she saw when he was praised. She wanted to protect that hope. Days rolled by, and one crisp autumn morning about a week before Jayden's birthday, a social worker named Alan visited the school. Mrs. Gallagher found him in the main office, requesting to see Ms. Alvarez and the principal, Ms. Brinkley. They met behind closed doors, and after about an hour, Ms. Alvarez stepped out, beckoning Mrs. Gallagher to join them. The air felt charged, as though the building itself held its breath. Inside the principal's office, Alan explained that they'd seen enough evidence of emotional abuse to justify removing Jayden from Regina's care. However, the process was slowed by Regina's cooperation with her own attorney, who insisted that her methods were strict but lawful. The legal system had to be convinced that this was indeed child abuse. The final decision would be made at a hearing scheduled about 2 weeks after Jayden's birthday. Mrs. Gallagher felt her stomach twist in dismay. "So what happens to Jayden in the meantime?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice calm. Alan sighed. "He remains in her care until the hearing, unless something more urgent arises." He held up his hand to forestall the teacher's protest. "If we see any immediate danger, we can expedite removal. We're monitoring him closely through weekly check-ins. You do realize the damage that can be done in that time, right?" Ms. Alvarez said, her frustration barely concealed. Alan nodded, weary lines etched beneath his eyes. "We know. But emotional abuse cases are tough. The more thorough we are, the stronger our case when we go before the judge. We need enough evidence to make it absolutely clear that Jayden's well-being is compromised." Mrs. Gallagher clenched her hands together. She understood the red tape. She had encountered bureaucratic delays in the past, but this one felt like it had a clock ticking. Jayden's birthday was fast approaching, a date he had been told wasn't his to claim. She forced herself to nod, acknowledging the social worker's difficult position. When the meeting ended, she returned to her classroom, finding it difficult to concentrate on her lesson plans. She wanted to do something, anything, to reassure Jayden that he truly had a birthday. An odd sense of urgency pulsed through her, as if that approaching date marked more than just the day he was born. It felt like a line in the sand where she had to show him that he mattered. In the days that followed, she found opportunities to speak privately with him. She'd ask him about his dreams. Did he like reading? Did he have a favorite sport? Did he have any hobbies outside of school? Most of these questions were met with uncertain shrugs. He'd talk about reading, but only because reading was something he did to keep from losing points. He said it in such a matter-of-fact tone that her heart broke a little more each time. Yet there was something that lit a spark in him: drawing. She discovered this when she saw him doodling in the margins of his notebook, small sketches of houses, animals, and scenes of children playing games outside. She didn't pry too much, but she casually asked if he liked to draw at home. Jayden shrugged, saying Regina didn't see drawing as an important skill. He hadn't quite earned free time to pursue it. One evening, about 5 days before Jayden's birthday, Mrs. Gallagher sat at her kitchen table, nursing a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The bright overhead light accentuated the stack of students' papers she was grading, but her mind was on the phone conversation she just had with Ms. Alvarez. The counselor had updated her. Apparently, Regina was aware of the investigation but insisted she had done nothing wrong. She claimed she was merely teaching the children discipline and that if they wanted to celebrate birthdays, they only had to meet the standard she set. The concept revolted Mrs. Gallagher. How could someone so systematically tear down a child's sense of worth? By commodifying love, affection, and basic human celebrations, Regina had essentially stripped Jayden of the belief that he was worthy just for existing. It was a horrifying mirror image of the love Mrs. Gallagher tried to show her students every single day. She felt a fresh wave of indignation as she imagined Regina's stoic, self-righteous posture. No, she decided. Jayden would have a birthday, and it would happen on October 14th, if not at Regina's house, then somewhere else. Even if it caused friction, even if Regina tried to punish him for it, Mrs. Gallagher believed the boy deserved at least one day that was undeniably his. Over the next few days, she spoke quietly with Ms. Alvarez about what she intended to do. The counselor was cautious, worried that going behind Regina's back might escalate the tension. "Just be careful," Ms. Alvarez said. "We don't want Regina to use it as evidence that the school is interfering. She could twist it around, claim we're overstepping boundaries, or trying to sabotage her rules." Still, Mrs. Gallagher pressed on. She planned something small at the school, just a modest celebration. She arranged with a few staff members to get a cupcake, maybe a balloon or two. Nothing too elaborate, nothing that could be interpreted as an attack. But enough to let Jayden know that his birthday existed, that it was real and important to the people who cared about him. As October 14th arrived, the air turned crisp, leaves drifting in orange and red flurries around the playground. Mrs. Gallagher had woken early that day, her chest tight with both excitement and nerves. She carried a small bakery box containing a cupcake with bright blue frosting. She tucked it out of sight in a cupboard so the other children wouldn't be distracted during morning lessons. As she wrote the day's math problems on the board, she glanced at Jayden, who was busy taking notes, meticulously copying the numbers. He was even more withdrawn than usual. Perhaps he sensed the date. She wondered if Regina had reminded him that he hadn't earned it. At lunchtime, as children bustled out of the classroom in a rush, Mrs. Gallagher asked Jayden if he could stay behind for a moment. He nodded, glancing around, perhaps wondering what he had done wrong. She closed the door quietly once the last chatter of voices vanished down the hallway. Turning, she found Jayden standing by his desk, his eyes downcast. She approached him softly, pulling the small bakery box from her cabinet. "Jayden," she said, her voice warm, "I wanted to give you something. Happy birthday." He froze, eyes darting to the box in her hands, a spark of confusion playing in his gaze. "But," he began, shifting uncomfortably, I wasn't good enough this week. I messed up on my chores and Ms. Regina said," his voice wavered, trailing off. Mrs. Gallagher's heart clenched. She set the box on his desk and opened it. Inside sat the cupcake, a single candle ready. "You don't have to earn a birthday," she said gently. "It's a day to celebrate you, the day you came into this world. It's already yours." His eyes flicked to the treat, taking in the bright color of the frosting, the candle standing proudly in the center. He reached out tentatively, as though afraid it might disappear the moment he touched it. Mrs. Gallagher took out a lighter, carefully lit the candle, and softly said, "Make a wish." For a few moments, Jayden just stood there, staring at the flickering flame. When he finally looked up, she saw tears brimming in his eyes. "I don't know what to wish for," he whispered. The statement held decades of sorrow in a single sentence. "Anything you want," she said, voice trembling with empathy. "Something that makes you happy, or that you hope will come true." He closed his eyes, and she watched the flicker of emotions dance across his small features. Then, just as carefully, he blew out the candle. The smoke curled upward, disappearing in the still air of the classroom. A ghost of a smile curved on his lips, uncertain but there nonetheless. She cut the cupcake in half with a plastic knife, offering him the bigger portion. "Want to share?" she said, taking a smaller piece. Jayden nodded, and for a few moments, They both ate in silence. The sweet taste was enough to coax a soft hum from him, as though he'd never quite had anything so delightful. Mrs. Gallagher sat next to him and said, "I'm proud of you, Jayden. And I want you to remember that your birthday isn't something anyone can take away." He didn't respond, but she noted the relief in his gaze. She realized then that even if Regina tried to punish him for celebrating, this moment was worth it, carving out a space in his life where he was allowed to feel normal, if only for a heartbeat. After lunch, Jayden slipped back into the group as if nothing had happened, but Mrs. Gallagher could see a difference in him. He was quieter than usual, but there was a subtle lift in his posture, a slight lessening of the weight on his shoulders. When the final bell rang, he hesitated, waiting until most of the other children had left before he approached her. In a hushed voice, he said, "Thank you," then hurried out, gripping his backpack straps tight. That evening, Mrs. Gallagher felt anxious, worrying how Regina might react if she found out. She tried to reassure herself that the cupcake was a small, private gesture. Jayden could choose whether or not to mention it. Yet, she had a gnawing fear that Regina would somehow sense he'd had a moment of celebration. She pictured Regina's stern face, scolding him for daring to believe he was worthy of a birthday. The mental image churned in her mind, made her wish the system would act faster. 2 days later, Ms. Alvarez flagged her down in the hallway, a troubled expression creasing her forehead. "I got a call from Jayden's caseworker, Alan," she said. "Regina's furious. She claims Jayden's been acting out since someone made him think birthdays are unconditional. She says she's going to talk to the principal about teachers meddling in her parenting." Mrs. Gallagher felt her heart race. "Meddling?" she echoed, voice tight with indignation. "She's hurting him. I'm trying to help." "I know," Ms. Alvarez replied quickly. "Just be prepared. She might try to spin this to make you look like the problem." Mrs. Gallagher nodded. Fear mingled with anger in her chest. She'd spent years trying to do right by her students, often going above and beyond. Could she now be penalized for it? It seemed unthinkable. But she reminded herself that children in foster care were especially vulnerable, caught between a teacher's moral imperative and a foster parent's legal rights. She steeled herself, determined to stand by Jayden no matter what. As Ms. Alvarez predicted, Regina came storming into the school the next morning. Mrs. Gallagher was in the middle of a reading lesson when the principal's voice crackled over the intercom. "Mrs. Gallagher, please report to the principal's office." She glanced at Jayden. He shrank in his seat, dread etched on his face. "I'll be right back," she murmured to the class, forcing a smile that likely fooled no one. The walk to the principal's office felt far too short. Upon entering, she saw Regina seated across from Principal Brinkley. Regina was a tall woman with a stiff posture, dressed in a conservative skirt and blazer. Her hair was pulled back into a tight bun, emphasizing the sharp angles of her face. She barely looked at Mrs. Gallagher, choosing instead to direct her gaze at a spot on the wall, her posture exuding disapproval. Principal Brinkley, a calm woman in her 50s with salt and pepper hair, gestured for Mrs. Gallagher to sit. The tension in the room was thick enough to stifle. Regina wasted no time. "I heard that you gave my foster child a birthday treat," she said, her voice tight. "Jayden's not allowed to celebrate yet. He hasn't met the standards I set. We had a deal. When he's proven responsible, he can have that privilege. But now you've undermined my authority." Mrs. Gallagher bristled. "It was a small gesture," she said, struggling to keep her tone measured. "Children deserve to be acknowledged on their birthdays. He's 8 years old. He shouldn't have to earn basic recognition." Regina's eyes narrowed. "You don't understand how important discipline is for children with troubled backgrounds," she said, her voice cracking with a smug edge. "You're not the one dealing with them 24 hours a day. You're only with them a few hours at school. You can't begin to comprehend how difficult they can be." Mrs. Gallagher inhaled slowly. "I recognize that foster parenting is challenging. But withholding birthdays or any form of affection as a reward." Regina cut her off. "It's not your place to question my parenting methods. I have the right to teach him discipline as I see fit, especially since I'm the one the state trusts to look after him. And you have no idea what that boy has done." He lies, he sneaks around. Enough, the principal interjected quietly, holding up a hand. She turned a measured gaze on Regina. Mrs. Cobb, Ms. Alvarez and Mrs. Gallagher have both expressed concerns about Jaden's emotional well-being. CPS is involved. We're following the legal channels. Until a determination is made, the school cannot override your parenting. However, she paused, glancing at Mrs. Gallagher, we also have an obligation to ensure the emotional welfare of our students. In the future, it might be wise, she directed this at Mrs. Gallagher, to consult with the administration before making decisions that could conflict with a foster parent's wishes. The words sliced at Mrs. Gallagher like a quiet reprimand, though she understood the principal was likely trying to maintain neutrality to keep the school from legal repercussions. Still stung, Regina folded her arms, a triumphant expression flickering in her eyes. I'm glad we're clear, she said, rising from her seat. I want no more interference, or I'll file a formal complaint. Principal Brinkley inclined her head stiffly. Noted. Regina swept out of the office. Mrs. Gallagher remained seated for a moment, feeling a churn of frustration in her stomach. When she turned to the principal, her voice wavered. Please, we can't ignore what she's doing. Jaden's just a little boy. Principal Brinkley sighed, leaning back in her chair. She hesitated, then said quietly, You did the right thing morally, Sharon. But we have to be cautious legally. Continue documenting everything, and keep Ms. Alvarez in the loop. The hearing's soon. Mrs. Gallagher nodded, her throat tight. She felt a swirl of conflicting emotions, frustration at the system, anger at Regina, protective love for Jaden, and fear for what might happen if Regina decided to retaliate. She returned to her classroom, half expecting to find Jaden anxious or upset. But he was seated at his desk, silently working on a writing assignment. She realized how accustomed he must have become to living in fear, constantly aware that any adult confrontation might reflect badly on him or cost him points. Heart-heavy, she resumed teaching, though her mind was far from the lesson. Every glance in his direction made her wonder what was going on behind those solemn eyes. In the days that followed, Regina's anger festered. She began lodging small complaints. Jaden told her Mrs. Gallagher singled him out, or that the school was trying to brainwash him into thinking all birthdays were guaranteed. Regina requested that Jaden be transferred to another classroom, but the administration couldn't facilitate that request without a compelling reason. Ms. Alvarez, behind the scenes, insisted that removing Jaden from Mrs. Gallagher's class would do more harm than good, considering the bond he had formed with his teacher. Meanwhile, the hearing drew closer. The tension grew, as though everyone were bracing for a storm. Jaden's behavior became more withdrawn, his eyes dull, his responses curt. On a few occasions, Mrs. Gallagher caught him looking at the clock, almost as if he were counting down the minutes until he had to return to that house. One afternoon, Ms. Alvarez pulled Mrs. Gallagher aside with a glimmer of optimism. Alan's found other children who used to be in Regina's care, she said. They have stories of withheld celebrations, withheld affection, and emotional blackmail. He thinks we have a strong case. Mrs. Gallagher allowed herself a sigh of relief. So he'll be removed? She asked. If the judge sees it that way, yes, Ms. Alvarez answered. But let's keep our hopes tempered until we have a final ruling. The day of the hearing approached at a snail's pace. Jaden still arrived at school each morning, quiet and polite. Yet Mrs. Gallagher saw the same haunted acceptance in him. She longed to tell him that soon he might not have to go back to Regina's, but she didn't want to make a promise she wasn't certain she could keep. Finally, the morning of the hearing arrived. Ms. Alvarez and Mrs. Gallagher had both been asked to provide written statements. Ms. Alvarez had even recorded one of her counseling sessions with Jaden, with his permission, capturing his hesitant admissions about the development compliance logs. That evidence was crucial, Alan had said. By mid-afternoon, Ms. Alvarez rushed into Mrs. Gallagher's classroom with a breathless look of relief. It's done, she said. The judge ruled in our favor. They're removing him from Regina's home. He'll be placed in a temporary group setting until a suitable foster placement is found. Mrs. Gallagher's chest tightened at the word group setting. She knew how complicated the system could be. Even if it was better than Regina's emotional torture, group homes weren't always the most nurturing environment. But it was a stepping stone. He'd be out of that harmful house. She closed her eyes, exhaling a long breath. "When?" she asked. "Tonight," Ms. Alvarez said. "CPS is on their way to pick him up from Regina's right now." Mrs. Gallagher glanced toward the window. Jayden was at recess, running around with a couple of classmates, a rare moment of carefree movement in the crisp autumn air. She felt a wave of gratitude for the squeals of joy that drifted in from the playground. He deserved this freedom, deserved so much more than he'd been given. That evening, after the children left, she stayed late in her classroom, tidying up and reflecting on the day's events. Jayden hadn't shown a reaction. He didn't know that this was the last time he'd be going to Regina's house. A surge of protectiveness washed over her as she recalled all the heartbreak he had endured. She wondered where he would end up. She had always told herself she wasn't ready to be a foster parent. She was single, and while she was financially secure, she worried about how her job might limit the time she could dedicate to a child. But the more she thought about Jayden, the less she could bear the idea of him drifting into another uncertain environment. She picked up the phone, her fingers trembling, and dialed Ms. Alvarez's extension. The counselor answered after a couple of rings. "You think it's insane if I ask about fostering him myself?" Mrs. Gallagher asked, her heart pounding. She heard a light laugh on the other end, filled with warmth. "Not insane at all," Ms. Alvarez responded. "You'd be wonderful. You know the system. You know him. I think you should talk to Alan, let him know you're interested. There's paperwork, there's a process, but they often give priority to adults the child already knows and trusts." That night, Mrs. Gallagher lay in bed, the glow of her bedside lamp casting elongated shadows across the walls. She stared at the paperwork she'd downloaded from the foster care website, lines and lines of text that detailed the requirements, the training, the commitment. Her heart thrummed with nerves and excitement. She could imagine Jayden living under her roof, having a place he could call home without constantly worrying about losing points or privileges. The idea made her smile, tears stinging her eyes. The following morning, she tracked down Ms. Alvarez first thing. "I want to do it," she said. "I want to be considered as a foster parent for Jayden." The counselor beamed, promising to help in any way she could. They made calls to Alan, who sounded genuinely pleased. "We usually encourage prior relationship placements," he told her. "It gives the child more stability. Let's set up a meeting and get the wheels turning." In the days that followed, Mrs. Gallagher could hardly contain her anticipation. She navigated background checks, interviews, and home inspections. It was a whirlwind of official steps, but each day she came closer to the possibility that Jayden might move in with her. He, of course, had no idea yet. He was in a temporary group home, waiting for the system to find him a permanent place. She wanted to tell him personally once everything was more certain. Life at school took on a different tone for Jayden during that period. Freed from Regina's oppressive environment, he slowly began to open up. A small seedling of trust unfurled in him, nurtured by teachers and counselors who recognized that no child should be deprived of affection. He'd sometimes tell Ms. Alvarez about how quiet the group home could be at night, but how at least nobody withheld basic kindness as a way of controlling him. He still wasn't sure about his future, and that uncertainty sometimes weighed on him, but there was a subtle release in his posture. Mrs. Gallagher used every opportunity to show him that he was valued. She praised him in class when he showed improvement. She encouraged him to keep drawing, even if the art supplies at the group home were limited. He seemed shy, but appreciative, and occasionally, she glimpsed a real smile spread across his face, a stark contrast to the haunted look he had worn before. One late afternoon, she was sorting papers in the staff lounge when Ms. Alvarez found her. "Good news," the counselor said, taking a seat next to her. "Your background checks and references are all clear. The home visit went perfectly. The agency wants to proceed with placing Jayden with you, if he agrees." Mrs. Gallagher felt a rush of warmth spread through her chest. She was almost afraid to believe it. "When will they tell him?" she asked. "Well," Ms. Alvarez replied, "Alan thought it might be best if you told him yourself. He trusts you, and it would be meaningful if the invitation came directly from you. Would you like to schedule a private chat with him?" Mrs. Gallagher nodded, a tear escaping down her cheek. "Yes, absolutely." They arranged for Jayden to come into Ms. Alvarez's office after school the following day. Mrs. Gallagher was a bundle of nerves all morning. Her stomach churned as she taught spelling and math, as though she were the one awaiting a life-changing decision. When the final bell rang, she gently asked Jayden to follow her to the counselor's office. He complied, looking slightly puzzled. Inside, Ms. Alvarez gave them some space, offering to wait outside for a few minutes. Mrs. Gallagher took a seat, gesturing for Jayden to do the same. He sat down, his eyes filled with quiet curiosity. She took a breath, trying to steady her racing heart. "Jayden," she began gently, "we've been looking for a good home for you, one where you'll feel safe and cared for, and where you never have to earn love or affection. The people at CPS have been working really hard. They know how talented you are, and they want you to be in a place where you can explore drawing, reading, anything you want, without fear." Jayden listened, still uncertain. Mrs. Gallagher swallowed against the dryness in her throat. "I volunteered to be that home," she continued, her voice shaky. "I spoke with Ms. Alvarez and your caseworker, Alan. I told them that I'd be honored if you came to live with me as your foster mom. That is, if you'd like that too." She watched him blink, confusion flickering into cautious hope. He opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. "But, you're my teacher," he said at last, as though unsure if teachers were allowed to do such things. She offered a trembling smile. "I can be both, your teacher at school and your foster parent at home, if you want. The foster system doesn't forbid it, as long as we both agree. I have a house with a spare room that can be yours. And you'd never have to worry about me taking your birthday away, or telling you that you have to earn anything just to be treated with kindness. You deserve love, Jayden." She saw tears well up in his eyes, and for a moment, she thought he might burst into sobs. But instead, he simply leaned forward and placed a small hand on her wrist. "Will I?" He hesitated, searching for words. "Will I really get to have birthdays forever?" A lump swelled in her throat. "Yes," she whispered. "Every single one. And not just birthdays. Halloween, Christmas, or any other holiday you want to celebrate. Or no holiday at all, if that's what you prefer. You'll have your own room, your own bed, and as many hugs as you can handle." He stared at her for a long moment, as though trying to grasp a world where these things were true. Finally, he nodded, very slowly at first, then with more certainty. He whispered, "I'd like that." Mrs. Gallagher exhaled the breath she hadn't realized she was holding, tears now streaming freely down her cheeks. She reached out and hugged him gently, mindful not to overwhelm him. His small arms wrapped around her, and she felt him tremble with what she prayed was relief. From outside the door, Ms. Alvarez entered, her face glowing. She knelt beside them. "I take it that's a yes?" she asked with a gentle smile. Jayden nodded, looking up at her with watery eyes. Ms. Alvarez beamed. "Then we'll finalize everything. You'll move in with Mrs. Gallagher soon." In the flurry of the next few days, paperwork was signed, and the official stamp of approval came through. One crisp afternoon, Mrs. Gallagher drove her car to the group home to pick up Jayden and his belongings. The sum of his life fit into a single duffel bag, a stark reminder of how transitory foster care could be. But as he climbed into the passenger seat, she resolved that, if it was within her power, this would be the last time he'd have to pack his life into a bag to move somewhere else. They made the short drive to her house, a modest single-story home with a small yard. The leaves in the yard were turning golden, the early autumn sunshine casting a gentle glow across the lawn. She pulled into the driveway, her palms sweating on the steering wheel. Would he like his new room? Would he feel comfortable? What if he was overwhelmed by the changes? She popped the trunk and retrieved his bag, leading him inside. He stood in the entryway, taking in the living room with wide eyes. The soft couch, the bookshelf filled with children's novels and teachers' references, the small TV in the corner. She led him down the hallway to a room she had prepared for him. A twin bed with dinosaur sheets, a small desk, and a set of colored pencils and drawing pads neatly arranged. His mouth fell open slightly when he saw the art supplies. "Are these for me?" he asked, wonder in his voice. She nodded, her heart full. "Yes. You can draw whenever you like. No one's going to take them away because of some made-up rule. This is your room, Jaden. You can decorate it how you want, bring home pictures from school, whatever feels right to you." He took a tentative step toward the bed, running his hand over the comforter as though verifying it was real. Then he turned to face her, emotion shining in his eyes. "I never had my own room before," he said, his voice raw with gratitude. "Even when I was with my mom, my birth mom, we moved around a lot. I always had to sleep in the same room with other kids or, sometimes, with her." Mrs. Gallagher's chest tightened at the mention of his birth mother. She'd gleaned from the file that his biological home life was unstable, leading to his removal and eventual foster care. She didn't know all the details, but it had been enough to place him in the system. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Well, now you have a space that's yours. I hope you'll feel at home here." He nodded. For a moment, they stood there quietly. She could sense the swirl of emotions he must be experiencing: relief, anxiety, maybe even guilt for leaving the group home so quickly. She closed the door to give him a moment alone to settle. "I'll be just down the hall if you need me," she said. "Take your time, Jaden." She returned to the living room, exhaling a breath. Her mind churned with questions. Would she be a good parent? Was she ready for all the challenges that came with fostering a child who had been through so much? Yet, beneath those nerves lay a strong certainty that she had done the right thing. That night, they shared a simple dinner. She made spaghetti, one of the few dishes she knew most kids enjoyed. Jaden ate quietly, occasionally glancing around as if still mapping his new surroundings. She tried to ask him about his day, about what he liked. They spoke in small increments, but each exchange felt like a milestone. She noticed he helped clear the table without being asked, almost as though he expected there to be a punishment if he didn't do so perfectly. When she smiled and thanked him, he looked momentarily startled, then slowly returned the smile. That was how deeply Regina's system of control had reached into his psyche. After dinner, she showed him how to work the TV remote. He watched an animated show with mild fascination, though it seemed he was more enthralled by the novelty of being allowed to watch television without earning it. Meanwhile, Mrs. Gallagher quietly folded laundry, sneaking glances at him every now and then. The feeling of a child in her home, especially Jaden, made her chest warm with a sense of purpose she had never quite experienced. When bedtime rolled around, she gently knocked on his door. He was sitting at his new desk, sketching something with the colored pencils. She smiled. "Time to wind down, buddy," she said softly. "You can finish that tomorrow." He set the pencil down, then looked at her with a worried expression. "Are you going to keep the notebook?" he asked hesitantly. She blinked, not immediately understanding. "Notebook?" He nodded. "To write down points, so you can see if I'm good enough for a hug or for dessert." Her heart shattered at the simplicity with which he asked. She placed a hand gently on his back. "No, Jaden. I'll never do that. If you forget to do something, or if you make a mistake, we'll talk about it, and we'll figure out how to fix it. But there's no log, no points. You don't lose your right to love and care for being a kid." He stared at her, eyes glistening, then slowly nodded. She led him to the bed, pulling back the dinosaur blanket. He climbed in, nestling his head on the pillow, still wide-eyed. She hesitated, then leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead. "Good night, Jaden," she whispered, flicking off the light. "I'm here if you need anything." As she backed out of the room, she saw his small figure under the covers, his gaze on the ceiling. She could only imagine the swirl of emotions. Yet, there was something peaceful in his posture that gave her hope. Over the next few weeks, life found a new rhythm. Jaden started referring to her as Mrs. G outside of school and Miss Gallagher in class, which made them both laugh. He was initially careful at home, as if waiting for a rule to be broken or a punishment to appear out of nowhere. Every time she reassured him that a mishap, like spilling a glass of milk, did not result in lost points, he seemed a bit more at ease. Gradually, she saw his personality emerging, a quiet but thoughtful boy who loved to draw whimsical scenes. He had a particular fascination with outer space, and once covered 3 pages in doodles of rocket ships and different planets. Still, not everything was smooth. There were nights when he had nightmares. He wouldn't say what they were about, but she guessed they involved Regina's house or possibly his time before that. He'd come into the living room or stand in her bedroom doorway, tremors shaking his small frame. She'd invite him to sit with her, and she'd rub his back until he relaxed enough to go back to bed. He was also hesitant to ask for anything new. If they passed by a store window and he saw something he liked, he quickly averted his gaze, as if wanting to avoid creating an opportunity for disappointment. She gently encouraged him to speak up about his interests, even if they couldn't always afford certain things. She wanted him to know that wanting something was not a crime, nor was it a test of compliance. Back at school, the other kids noticed a change in Jayden. He was a bit more talkative, occasionally raising his hand to answer questions in class. He still had a subdued demeanor, but it was as though the sun had broken through the clouds, and a small ray of light shone on him. That alone made Mrs. Gallagher's heart swell with relief. But storms sometimes strike just when the sky seems at its clearest. About a month after Jayden moved in, Ms. Alvarez came to Mrs. Gallagher with disconcerting news. Regina had filed an official complaint against the school and, specifically, against Mrs. Gallagher, alleging that Jayden had been coached to say certain things in order to be removed from her home. She claimed that Ms. Alvarez and Mrs. Gallagher conspired to steal her foster child. Mrs. Gallagher felt her heart sink. "Is this going to affect Jayden's placement with me?" she asked, struggling to keep the panic from her voice. Ms. Alvarez squeezed her shoulder. "It shouldn't, but the complaint has to be investigated. Child Protective Services will likely interview you again, just to confirm that none of this is true. Regina is probably trying to save face or lash out because she lost the case." Mrs. Gallagher's jaw tightened. The idea that Regina could still meddle in Jayden's life made her stomach churn. She tried to remind herself that the judge's ruling had been clear, that the hearing had included testimonies from other children Regina had fostered and from professionals who had seen her logs. None of it was up for debate. But the complaint still cast a pall over the sense of peace that she and Jayden had been building. In the days that followed, a CPS representative visited her home, speaking briefly with Jayden while Mrs. Gallagher waited in another room. Jayden emerged afterward, looking a bit rattled. She comforted him, explaining that sometimes grown-ups have to double-check that he's in a safe place because they care. Still, the experience unsettled him. Even so, daily life moved forward. Mrs. Gallagher balanced her teaching responsibilities with the emotional demands of fostering Jayden. She found support in Ms. Alvarez, the staff at the group home, and even other teachers who had experience with the foster system. At night, she occasionally lay awake, her mind tumbling through woofs, but each morning she found renewed resolve in Jayden's slow but steady progress. He was sleeping a bit better, and he'd begun to mention small goals for the future, like trying out for the soccer team next year or joining the art club when he reached middle school. By the time Thanksgiving approached, Mrs. Gallagher knew it was time to introduce Jayden to broader celebrations, letting him experience holidays without fear. She had no idea whether he'd ever carved a pumpkin or set up a Christmas tree. He'd missed so many normal childhood moments. As a first step, she decided to invite him to help shop for groceries for a small Thanksgiving dinner, just the two of them, unless he wanted to invite a friend. He was tentative at first, not sure if he was allowed to choose any of the food. She encouraged him to pick what he liked: stuffing, mashed potatoes, maybe a pumpkin pie. He hesitated, then selected a can of cranberry sauce, stating quietly that he'd tasted it once in a cafeteria and sort of liked it. She saw his eyes light up when she dropped the can into the grocery cart, as though each item was a tiny step toward a new sense of belonging. On Thanksgiving Day, they stood side by side in the kitchen, the savory sense of turkey and stuffing filling the air. She taught him how to mash the potatoes, guiding his small hands. He beamed with pride at the simple act of contributing to the meal, unafraid that a mistake might cost him. Later, they sat at the table with 2 plates, the steam rising from the food in gentle wisps. Jayden stared at it for a moment, and then at her, as if uncertain what to say. "Is this normal?" he asked softly. She smiled, placing a napkin in her lap. Yes, Jaden. Many families gather to eat a special meal on Thanksgiving. It's a time to be grateful for what we have. He contemplated that, then looked down at his plate. I'm grateful I'm here, he said quietly. Even if it's just us. Mrs. Gallagher felt tears prick her eyes, but she masked them with a wide grin. Me too, she said, her voice thick with emotion. They clinked their water glasses in a gentle toast, and she silently vowed that each holiday from now on would remind him that he was valued. In the midst of these heartwarming moments, the looming shadow of Regina's complaint still existed. Investigations take time, and though logically Mrs. Gallagher knew the outcome would likely be in her favor, she couldn't help the knot of anxiety that formed whenever she saw a letter from the state or a missed phone call from the CPS office. She feared Regina might manipulate the truth again. One chilly afternoon, she was reorganizing books in her classroom after school when Ms. Alvarez stepped in, her cheeks flushed from the cold outside. I just heard from Alan, she announced, her eyes bright. The complaint was officially dismissed. Regina had no evidence to back her accusations, and the system found everything to be properly handled. You're in the clear. Relief swept over Mrs. Gallagher like a wave. She rested her forehead against the tall shelf for a moment, then let out a shaky laugh. Thank goodness, she whispered. I was afraid she'd keep trying. She might, but the state stance is clear. Jaden is safer and happier with you. Ms. Alvarez grinned. You did it, Sharon. He's yours to care for without that looming threat. Mrs. Gallagher nodded, her eyes misty. She thought of Jaden's uncertain face when he first told her, she says I don't have a birthday. How far they had come from that moment. Now, he had a home, and no one was threatening to take away his celebrations anymore. The next week, as if on cue, the first snowfall dusted the city. Mrs. Gallagher peered through the classroom windows, watching big white flakes drift down. During recess, the children dashed outside, squealing with excitement. She caught sight of Jaden among them, gingerly picking up a handful of snow and forming a tiny, lopsided snowball. He smiled when he saw her watching through the window. It was a smile that reached his eyes, and she felt her chest surge with warmth. She thought back to that empty poster he had months ago. The poster that had started it all. Maybe it wasn't quite accurate to say that was the beginning. Perhaps the story began long before Jaden came to her class. But from her perspective, that was the day she realized how profoundly a child could be made to feel invisible. Now, he was not invisible. He had a place in the world. And so, she decided it was time to fill in the gaps, to let him be proud of who he was. That weekend, she surprised him by bringing down a large poster board from the top of her closet. Let's make that All About Me poster now, she suggested, setting it on the kitchen table. We'll do it together, just for fun. You can keep it in your room when we're done. Jaden looked at the blank board, biting his lip, then nodded. She handed him colorful markers and crayons. Slowly, carefully, he wrote his name at the top in neat block letters. G. Underneath, he wrote, I am 8 years old. Then paused, glancing at her for reassurance. She nodded, smiling. Encouraged, he listed favorite color, blue, favorite food, spaghetti, favorite thing to do, draw. He doodled a small rocket ship in one corner, the Earth in another. Finally, he came to the section that asked for his birthday. He stared at it for a moment, eyes shimmering with a complex mix of emotions. She watched him swallow, then very deliberately wrote, October 14th. Once the words were there, he traced over them a second time, making the letters bold as though reclaiming that date. Mrs. Gallagher leaned over and gave him a gentle hug. That's yours, she said softly. Always. He hugged her back, and she felt him exhale a breath that carried what seemed like 1,000 past burdens. The next day, he proudly taped the poster on his bedroom wall, next to one of his space drawings. The winter holidays arrived quickly. Mrs. Gallagher was determined to make them special. She and Jaden picked out a small Christmas tree from a local lot, which he helped decorate with simple ornaments. She taught him how to hang stockings by the fireplace. She had an electric fireplace, but it was enough for the atmosphere. She saw him tentatively place a paper star at the tree's peak. He asked if he was allowed to wish for something. She said yes, of course. Later that night, she found him gazing at the star in silence, no doubt forming wishes he was still getting used to feeling safe enough to have. In school, the holiday spirit was evident. The children discussed winter break plans, some traveling to see relatives, others expecting big family gatherings. Jayden still had only Mrs. Gallagher, but he didn't seem lonely. He seemed content, gradually learning what it felt like to be part of a family that cared. On the last day before break, Mrs. Gallagher saw a group of classmates invite Jayden to join in a game of tag. He hesitated, but eventually joined, his laughter mingling with theirs. That night, the house was quiet, the glow of Christmas lights illuminating the living room. Jayden approached her, fiddling with his hands. "Mrs. G," he said, his voice wobbling slightly. She turned from the sofa, concern in her eyes. "Yes, sweetie." He bit his lip. "I just wanted to say, thank you. For letting me be here. For everything." Her heart twisted with a mix of love and sympathy. She knelt down, taking his hands. "You're welcome," she said softly. "But you never need to thank me for loving you, Jayden. That's not how love works." He nodded, tears threatening to spill. She pulled him into a gentle embrace, and they stayed that way for a long moment. She thought about how far he had come from that day in class, how unthinkable it was that a child should feel he didn't even have a birthday. She resolved right then that she would do everything in her power to see him thrive. As the new year dawned, so did fresh challenges and fresh joys. Jayden's nightmares became less frequent, but he still had moments of flashbacks, times when his entire posture would tense if he worried he'd angered Mrs. Gallagher. She learned to reassure him with words, gentle touches, and consistency. One of the biggest breakthroughs came when he painted a watercolor picture of a birthday cake topped with 8 candles, presenting it to her with a shy grin. "For next time," he said, as though confirming that a future birthday was guaranteed. Late that spring, Ms. Alvarez and Alan arranged a meeting with Mrs. Gallagher to discuss permanency plans. The ultimate goal, as with all foster children, was to see if reunification with the birth family was possible. If not, the next option might be adoption. The birth mother's situation remained uncertain. She had made no contact with Jayden in a long time. Mrs. Gallagher felt guilty for the relief that knowledge gave her. She wanted Jayden to know his birth mother if it was safe and if it was truly in his best interest, but she also felt protective of him, wanting to shield him from further disappointment. The possibility of adopting Jayden drifted into her mind more and more. Whenever she imagined him moving on to another placement, it made her heart ache. But adoption was a massive step, one that required the courts to sever or permanently relinquish parental rights. She also worried about whether it was the best choice for him. Was she enough for him? Was she prepared to give him everything he needed in life? One evening, as they were cleaning up after dinner, Jayden spoke in a small voice. "Are you going to keep me forever?" She looked at him, her chest tightening. Carefully, she set down the plate she was drying. "Do you want me to keep you forever?" she asked. He nodded, not looking up. "Yeah, I do. But what if they say I can't stay?" 1,000 emotions collided in her chest. She knelt beside him, hooking a finger under his chin so he'd meet her eyes. "Then we'll fight it," she said softly. "We'll fight it together. I can't promise what the courts will do, but I promise that I'm not going to give up on you." He stared at her for a moment, a single tear tracking down his cheek. Then, with unexpected boldness, he threw his arms around her neck. She held him tightly, her own tears escaping. That night, after he went to bed, she sat at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. She realized with a kind of trembling certainty that she wanted to adopt him. The question was whether it would be possible. When she mentioned it to Ms. Alvarez, the counselor smiled widely, though she cautioned that it could be a lengthy process. The system would likely require more time to determine that reunification with the birth mother was not viable. But Mrs. Gallagher found renewed energy to pursue it. She spent the next few months juggling her teaching responsibilities, caring for Jayden, and meeting with social workers and attorneys to explore the path to adoption. Each conversation felt like scaling a small mountain. There were forms, background checks, updates to her home study. Every step, however burdensome, reminded her of the bigger picture, giving Jayden a permanent, loving home. During this period, Jayden flourished. He made friends at school, joined an after-school art club, and even started to show some interest in reading chapter books for fun rather than just for points. Occasionally, Regina's name came up in hushed staff conversations, but Jayden didn't seem to ask about her. He also never expressed an interest in returning to any previous placement. When asked about his foster mother in therapy sessions, he simply shook his head, saying, "I don't want to go back. She said I had to earn my birthday." As the months passed, the leaves turned green, then golden. Another October arrived, Jayden's next birthday. This time, Mrs. Gallagher planned a small party at her house. She invited a few of Jayden's classmates, Ms. Alvarez, and some of her close colleagues. Jayden's eyes glowed as they hung up streamers and balloons, a far cry from the boy who once said, "I don't have a birthday." The party was simple: pizza, board games, and a homemade cake with 9 candles. When the moment came to light them, Jayden's smile was radiant. He blew them out, making a wish with so much enthusiasm that some cake frosting splattered across the table. The small group applauded. He glanced around, slightly embarrassed, but mostly joyful. Mrs. Gallagher snapped a photo, capturing the moment forever: Jayden's shining grin, a circle of supportive friends around him, each wearing a party hat. That photo would eventually go on the wall in his room, beside his drawings of rocket ships. Not long after this birthday celebration, the final step in the adoption process neared. The courts had determined that reunification was unlikely, and with the birth mother's rights terminated due to neglect and abandonment, Jayden was legally free for adoption. The path was open for Mrs. Gallagher to become his permanent mother, no longer just a foster figure. The day the adoption was finalized was one of the happiest in both their lives. The judge, a kind-faced woman, smiled down at Jayden, who stood in a collared shirt, shifting from foot to foot. "Do you understand what this means, Jayden?" the judge asked. "It means Mrs. Gallagher is your mother forever now. You'll stay with her, and no one can take that away." He nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. He looked up at Mrs. Gallagher, who clutched his hand in hers. "I want that," he said simply, his voice trembling with joy. The judge banged the gavel lightly, and just like that, the next chapter of Jayden's life began, one free of the burdens he had once carried. After the adoption ceremony, they went out for ice cream with Ms. Alvarez and a few others who had supported them. Jayden insisted on paying with the small allowance Mrs. Gallagher had started giving him. It was a moment of pride for him, a simple gesture that said he was not only free to celebrate but free to choose how to share happiness. As they finished their ice cream, Ms. Alvarez raised her cup in a little toast. "To Jayden, whose birthday will never be taken away," she said, smiling. Jayden clinked his spoon against her cup, grinning ear to ear. By then, Jayden had come to see that a family wasn't defined by the logs or points that Regina once used. Family was not contingent on earning love. Family was the steady presence that remained when you made mistakes, when you needed reassurance, and when you celebrated joyous occasions. Jayden found all of that in Mrs. Gallagher. In the months that followed, life settled into a steady rhythm. Jayden was simply her son, a fact that seemed both extraordinary and perfectly natural. He continued to do well in school, discovering new interests, and even daring to sign up for a school talent show to display his artwork. The nightmares diminished, though not entirely. There were still days he felt anxious, moments when he remembered the fear of losing everything for a minor mistake. But as time passed, those anxieties were overshadowed by the security he felt in a stable home. One Saturday morning, they were sorting through old boxes when Jayden discovered an old photo album of Mrs. Gallagher's. He flipped through pictures of her teaching earlier classes, younger versions of herself smiling with former students. Eventually, he came across a blank page near the back. "We could put pictures of us here," he suggested tentatively. Mrs. Gallagher smiled. "That's a wonderful idea." They printed a few of their favorite snapshots: the day they decorated the Christmas tree, the day of his 9th birthday party, and even a silly selfie they took at the park. Jayden carefully placed them on the page, writing little captions under each one, his neat handwriting matching the care he took. At the bottom, he paused, thinking carefully, then wrote, "Jayden and Mom." Mrs. Gallagher watched him, her eyes stinging with tears at the sight of that word, "Mum," written so casually, yet meaning more to her than words could express. She placed a hand gently on his shoulder, and he smiled up at her. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime of trials, Jaden truly belonged to a family. In that final step, there was no question that he would celebrate all the birthdays to come, no question that those celebrations were a basic right of his childhood. He was free to enjoy them without fear, each candle on the cake a testament to a year he had lived, survived, and grown stronger. The first 85% of his journey had been marred by conflict, tension, investigations, emotional manipulation, and the legal system's slow wheels. But now, in that precious last portion of his story, the resolution was bright and sure. Mrs. Gallagher faced the future with confidence, knowing that whatever came next, they would handle it together. And Jaden, the boy who once stared at a blank "All About Me" poster because he believed he didn't even have a birthday, went to bed each night knowing that he was not just allowed but wholeheartedly encouraged to celebrate who he was. His calendar no longer marked the days he had to be perfect. It marked the days he got to be a child, a son, an artist, a dreamer. In short, someone truly, irrevocably loved. Thank you for watching. If you believe every child deserves a chance to celebrate who they are, be sure to like and subscribe for more stories. We appreciate you joining us on this journey. Take care, and we'll see you in the next one.